What for you is the difference between food security and food sovereignty?
It's really interesting to have a discussion around the differences between these two because they're kind of nestled together, but there are nuances that set them apart. So to me, food security is just having immediate access to the food that I need to feed my family. And that might be on a short scale or a long scale. So food security could mean I have enough food to get for the next 2 weeks until my next paycheck to go and purchase food. So that means I have that much food security. But it can also mean I have a year's worth of food, which is the case for my family. The difference between food security, though, and food sovereignty is food security means I can access that food. It's there for me. Whereas food sovereignty means I have the knowledge, skills, equipment, resources, relationships in order to produce that food or obtain it all over again. And so the time scale of food security versus food sovereignty is a little bit different, whereas food sovereignty is ongoing and food security tends to be, I have this much food security. I have, X number of pounds. I have this many dollars invested in food security, whereas food sovereignty, it's more ongoing. It's harder to quantify, but it's more long lasting. I think the other big difference is that food security in my mind is very transactional, meaning I took $25 and I bought a bag of rice. And that for my family is food security. I bought it once, I'm going to use it up, and then it's gone. Whereas food security is, I actually know some people who harvest wild rice, and I could go out with them to harvest, or I could trade with them for obtaining some of that. So it's relationship based. It might be relationships based with people, or it might be relationships with the piece of land that I live on, that I know where the good soil is, and I know where to plant things to produce food. So there's a transactional versus relationship basis in terms of the difference, but then there's also a time frame of, this amount will last me this period of time, but this over here, this food sovereignty, it's ongoing and it's going to last perhaps for generations within my family. So those are the differences I see, but I'm really curious to hear from you, Javan. What are the differences in your mind between food security and food sovereignty?
I loved your answer. I loved your answer that one was transactional and one was relational. One is deep relation, deep wisdom, deep conversation with how one connects to their food and creates their food and recreates their food if there's an issue. And the first is more, do I have access? Is it there? And I think very similarly, it's if I lost all my food tomorrow, could I then, do I have the skills? Do I have the conversation? Do I have the relationships to be able to replace it in short order? And I think that's where, for me, it's that tipping point between security is, okay, it's in the pantry. I know where it is. I can go and I can touch it. Whereas sovereignty, not so much the ability to touch it, but the ability and the resolution and the deep satisfaction of knowing that I am the creator and I'm created through my food. And thus I have the ability to recreate my security at any one time. And one thing I like about that is when we're taking a look at an uncertain future and there's so much coming at us, and say we do have a lot of food, and this happened to colleagues of mine who were flooded out during the big flood of in British Columbia in December and November. They lost 2 years of food security. That security is gone. They were airlifted out. They were airlifted with their milking goat. They came with some of that security. But the sovereignty lasts. The sovereignty persists. They've left with that sovereignty, and that sovereignty is left with them. And so wherever they land, wherever they are, they're able to rebuild their security at any time.
Yeah, that replicability is important. One of the things that I think about as you're talking is when it comes to our relationship with the land around us, sometimes people will have this perception of, well, how did people even exist here? There's no food. Like, we're in a northern climate. It's so harsh. There's nothing to eat. And I have to laugh because that land produces food every year, every single year. And so food security would be my harvest of 1 year off that land. But food sovereignty is my relationship with it. It's knowing where the blueberries grow. Food sovereignty is knowing which of those greens are going to nourish my family and how I should cook them. Are they bitter or are they, really savory greens? How should I prepare them? That's my food sovereignty. It's that relationship with the land and that knowledge of it, a deep knowledge of it, how it behaves, where things grow, how they interact with each other. That's my food sovereignty when it comes to a topic like wild food harvesting or foraging. So we can look at the difference between food security and food sovereignty through many lenses, whether it's, like I said, those pantry items. If I have this amount of food storage, but, food security transitioning to food sovereignty would be I can obtain those things again through my relationships when it comes to things like wheat, because I don't grow wheat for my family, or rice. So then it's transitioning to those relationships through that lens of your pantry foods. It might also be from purchasing a certain amount at the farmer's market and processing it, having the ability to store that in terms of your food security of making pickles and making salsa and then having that there. But then food sovereignty means I can grow those things and I have the equipment to can it, to process it all over again. But I also might have the skills and knowledge to save seed from those things. So I can do this for many generations. And that's where we transition again to food sovereignty.
Brilliant. Brilliant. I think if anybody's watching this and they're thinking, okay, well, I get the distinction. I think a couple of questions folks could ask themselves is, when it comes to food, how secure am I? What do I have in the back pantry? What do I have in the cupboards? What do I have in the freezer? How much food do I have, and how long will that last in terms of the replication of the family and how much they eat and what's that frequency and all the rest of it. And then when food comes to food sovereignty, if the only way that you're food sovereign is how to go to the grocery store and purchase it, that's really on a food security side. So if we were to take away the industrial food system that has fed you, has fed me, conversation today isn't about denigrating that system, but about moving beyond it into a more stable, a more resilient, dare I say, more regenerative nature, that when and where and how we lose access, do we have the skills, the processes that allow us to grow more food, source more food, forage more food, speak to a farmer in a way that they want you to be their customer, because the way you speak to a farmer is not the way you speak to a cashier if you want food, because a farmer at any time can go, I'm pretty sure I don't have any food for you. And I've seen it happen, right? So I think that for me are two questions that I would, if I was watching this for the first time and if I wasn't steeped in food sovereignty and food security, I'd want to start pondering those questions. Any questions that you would have for folks that are kind of just first taking their first steps into this world?
Yeah, I would look at where have I invested? And so your investments, it's like a balance sheet so this is a more economic way of looking at things. When it comes to food sovereignty, the metrics that we're going to measure are different. So I would ask, where have you invested in food security versus food sovereignty? With food security, it's almost always a dollar value, or it's naming physical items. So it's naming, I have 6 sacks of flour, I have 19 jars of pickles, or it's a certain quantification that is very natural for us. But when it comes to food sovereignty, we're quantifying things differently. And so I would ask, how have you invested in food sovereignty? Have you been working on developing relationships? One of my favorite tasks that I'll give people when they're looking at building their relationships in their food shed is go to the old people in your community and ask them how they got through tough times in regards to food. Because those stories are a part of our food sovereignty also, those collective memories. So that's harder to quantify, but we could name perhaps the relationships that we've developed. And that's a quantification of food sovereignty. We could list off, well, I've learned all these skills. I learned how to identify a carrot weed. That's a pet peeve of mine when people pull out my carrots from my garden while they're helping me weed. So that's a skill that you have to develop. And again, it's harder to quantify that. And so I would challenge people to ask themselves, how have I invested in food sovereignty? And what that's going to do is it's going to illuminate in my mind what that means to me, how I interpret food sovereignty. And it's also going to illuminate for me where I have shortcomings. So if I can't name any relationships that I've invested in, I've identified a weak point. I need to build relationships. If I can't identify any food production skills that I've ever gained, I've identified a weak point, and that's a potential area for focus. So that's one of the questions that I would ask to get people's minds going on, well, what is food sovereignty? How do I measure if I have food sovereignty? And that can be a little bit harder, but it brings about some good thoughts for people.
Thanks so much, Natalie. I really appreciate your thoughts on this. You've been at this for such a long time and have been feeding your family and feeding others because you were part of one of the largest community supported agriculture farms in Alberta. So I love when you weigh in on these types of conversations. And for anybody else who's watching, if this is of interest to you, if you think, oh, I like food security, I like this conversation, this is important to me, and I want to grow either my security or my sovereignty, you may want to check out regenerativeliving.online/family food security. It's a program that Natalie and I run. It runs for 12 sessions over 7 months. We walk you through an entire season. Natalie is a spreadsheet wizard, forged in the flames of Harvard University, plus the roads or the University of Life, where we walk you through to understand where and what is your food shed, where is your food from, where is it coming from, how much food does your family need, and then through a very linear step-by-step process, we allow you to understand, well, how am I going to gather that food? Am I going to purchase that food? Am I going to grow that food? And how are we going to grow our food security and our food sovereignty in tandem? So if you're interested in that, check it out.